The invitation arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. It was not sent through social media or a public email list. It came through a private courier in a simple black envelope with thick paper and sharp silver lettering. Inside was a single card with a short message. You are invited to a private evening reception. Formal attire required. Location enclosed. At the bottom was the signature of one of the most powerful billionaires in the country. She read it twice to make sure it was real. She was not famous. She did not run a massive company. She was not a public speaker or influencer. She worked quietly as a strategic consultant, helping struggling businesses reorganize and survive. Most of her work happened behind closed doors. The companies she helped rarely mentioned her name. She preferred it that way. Still, she knew who the billionaire was. Everyone did. He was known for bold investments, sharp interviews, and a certain playful arrogance. He liked challenges. He liked attention. And he liked proving that he was always the smartest person in the room. She almost declined the invitation. The event was being held in a private penthouse that overlooked the entire city skyline. It was the kind of place she had only seen in magazines. Floor-to-ceiling windows, glass walls, polished marble floors, and soft golden lighting. The guest list included CEOs, investors, media figures, and a few well-known academics. She felt slightly out of place even before she arrived. On the evening of the event, she stood in front of her mirror for a long moment before leaving her apartment. She wore a simple dark dress, nothing flashy, nothing designed to impress. Her hair was tied neatly back. She chose comfort over drama. She reminded herself that she had earned her place in any room she entered. When she arrived, the building's lobby alone was larger than her entire office. Security checked her name against a digital list. Once confirmed, she was escorted to a private elevator that moved silently upward. As the doors opened at the top floor, she stepped into a different world. Soft music played in the background. Servers carried small plates of carefully arranged food. Groups of people stood in circles talking about markets, technology, and global investments. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and polished wood. She noticed how easily some people laughed. The laughter felt rehearsed, almost competitive. Conversations were less about listening and more about proving something. She stayed near the edge of the room at first, observing. Across the penthouse, near the wide windows, stood the billionaire himself. He was surrounded by guests, smiling confidently. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes moved quickly, scanning the room as if he were studying everyone. She had seen him in interviews before. In person, he looked exactly as he did on screen. Sharp suit, calm smile, and that unmistakable smirk that suggested he already knew the outcome of every situation. As the evening continued, more guests arrived. The noise level rose. Glasses clinked. Cameras flashed occasionally for private photographs. Then, just as the sun fully disappeared behind the city skyline, the music softened. The billionaire raised his hand slightly, and the room slowly grew quiet. "Thank you all for coming," he began. His voice carried easily across the room without effort. "Tonight isn't just about networking. It's about something more interesting." People leaned in. "I enjoy puzzles," he continued, "especially the kind that reveal how people think. So I've prepared something special." A few guests chuckled lightly, assuming it was a joke. He paused deliberately. "Solve this riddle," he said, holding up a single sheet of paper. "And I'll wire $200 million to the person who gets it right." Immediately, for a second, no one reacted. It sounded too dramatic to be serious. Then soft laughter spread across the room. Some thought it was a publicity stunt. Others assumed there would be hidden conditions. He smiled wider. "I'm serious. No tricks. No contracts. Just one riddle. Solve it correctly, and the money is yours." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations stopped. Phones were quietly pulled out of pockets. Eyes sharpened. Assistants began handing out printed copies of the riddle to each guest. When one reached her, she accepted it calmly and glanced down at the paper. The riddle was longer than expected. It wasn't a simple brain teaser. It involved a fictional scenario about three business partners, a locked vault, a shifting market pattern, and a decision that appeared logical on the surface but carried a hidden contradiction. Around her, she could hear whispers. This has to be mathematical. No, it's behavioral. It's a probability question. Some guests immediately began typing on their phones, likely searching for patterns or similar puzzles online. Others gathered in small groups to compare thoughts. The billionaire stood with his hands loosely folded in front of him, watching everyone carefully. That smirk never left his face. She did not join any group. Instead, she stepped slightly away from the crowd, near one of the tall windows. The city lights below flickered like stars. She read the riddle once, then again. She did not rush. She had spent years walking into failing companies where panic filled every meeting room. She had learned that speed often leads to mistakes. Calm observation, on the other hand, reveals cracks others miss. After a few minutes, the billionaire's voice broke through the murmurs. You have 1 hour. A subtle tension filled the room. Some guests began speaking more quickly. A few looked frustrated already. She noticed something small. The billionaire wasn't watching the guests who were speaking loudly. He was watching the quiet ones. That detail stayed with her. 10 minutes passed, then 15. One confident executive stepped forward. I believe the answer is based on market timing, he declared. He explained his reasoning clearly using complex financial terms. The billionaire listened politely. Then he shook his head once. Incorrect. Another attempt followed. This time, a professor suggested it was a logic trap related to decision theory. Again, the billionaire smiled. Interesting, but no. The room grew heavier. She crossed her arms, not out of defiance, but as a way to hold herself steady while thinking. The paper remained in her hand. The riddle mentioned trust between partners. It mentioned a locked vault that could only be opened if two keys were used together. It mentioned a sudden market crash that changed incentives. But something about the wording felt intentional. Too intentional. She looked up at the billionaire instead of the paper. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't even slightly concerned. He looked entertained. That meant he believed the riddle was nearly impossible, or that everyone was approaching it the wrong way. 30 minutes remained. Another guest attempted an answer. Wrong again. A quiet frustration began spreading through the penthouse. Some guests started joking that the money was never real. Others returned to casual conversation, pretending they were no longer interested. She read the final line of the riddle once more. A single sentence stood out. It seemed simple, almost unnecessary, as if added casually. But in her experience, nothing written by someone like him was casual. She lowered the paper slowly. The challenge, she realized, might not be about numbers at all. It might be about assumption. She took a slow breath. The noise around her faded slightly in her mind. She replayed the billionaire's exact words when he introduced the challenge. The tone, the pause, the way he emphasized certain phrases. 20 minutes remained. Someone near her whispered, "This is impossible." She almost smiled. Impossible problems usually hide very human mistakes. As the clock ticked down, she finally stepped away from the window and moved toward the center of the room. The billionaire noticed immediately. Their eyes met briefly. His expression did not change, but there was curiosity there now. She stopped a few feet away from him, arms still crossed, posture calm. "I have a question," she said, her voice steady and clear. The room grew quiet again. He tilted his head slightly. "Go ahead." She held up the paper. "Before I give an answer, I want to confirm something about the way this is written." A faint ripple moved through the crowd. Some looked relieved that someone else was finally speaking. Others looked doubtful. The billionaire's smirk returned, but this time it carried interest instead of amusement. "Ask," he said, and in that moment, the challenge truly began. The room felt different after she spoke. Moments earlier, people had been whispering in clusters, throwing out guesses, pretending not to care when they were wrong. But now all attention shifted toward her. Not because she had given an answer, but because of how she asked her question. "I want to confirm something about the wording," she had said. It was simple, calm. direct. The billionaire studied her with careful interest. He seemed amused, but not dismissive. "What would you like to confirm?" he asked. She held up the printed page slightly. In the third paragraph, it says the vault can only be opened if two keys are used together at the exact same time. Does exact same time mean physically simultaneous? Or does it mean within the same decision window? A few guests frowned. Some looked back down at their papers as if they had missed that detail entirely. The billionaire did not answer right away. He walked a slow half-circle around her, almost like a chess player studying a board from another angle. "Why does that matter?" he replied. "Because," she said gently, "those two meanings change everything." The air tightened. He gave a small smile. "You may assume it means physically simultaneous." She nodded once. "Thank you." She didn't say anything else. She stepped slightly to the side, thinking again. But the shift had already happened. The guests who had dismissed her now watched more closely. The ones who had been confident earlier now seemed less sure. Doubt was spreading, not about the riddle but about their own approach. Across the room, someone muttered, "I didn't even consider that." Another said quietly, "Neither did I." The billionaire returned to his place near the center. He folded his hands loosely again, but his expression had changed. The smirk was still there, but it was thinner now. 40 minutes had passed. 20 remained. A well-known investor stepped forward again. "If the keys must turn at the exact same time, then it's clearly a coordination problem," he said. "It's about trust between partners. One of them has an incentive to betray the other during the crash. Therefore, the solution is to create an external contract that forces cooperation." The billionaire shook his head. "You are solving a different problem." A few people laughed quietly, not cruelly but nervously. The investor stepped back, frustrated. She watched carefully. She wasn't focused only on the paper anymore. She was watching reactions, watching patterns. Most people in the room were trying to outthink the puzzle. They were treating it like a math equation or a strategic game. But the more she read it, the more she felt something else. It wasn't just about logic. It was about assumption. She read the opening line again. "Three partners agree that only mutual trust can protect their shared future." Why would a riddle start with that sentence? It sounded philosophical, not financial. 15 minutes remained. The tension in the room had grown heavy. Conversations were quieter now. People no longer joked. Even the servers had stepped back, sensing the seriousness. The billionaire glanced at his watch. "Time is running." She uncrossed her arms briefly and looked around the room. Some guests avoided her eyes. Others watched her with curiosity. She stepped forward again. "I have another question," she said. The billionaire raised an eyebrow slightly. "You're using your time wisely. Or wasting it," someone whispered behind her. She ignored it. "In the scenario," she continued, "it says the market crash changes incentives, but it never explains what the partners truly value most. Is it money alone? Or reputation? Or survival?" The billionaire's gaze sharpened. "That is for you to decide," he replied. She nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." This time she didn't step away. She stayed where she was, thinking aloud. If the partners only care about money, betrayal makes sense. If they care about reputation, betrayal becomes risky. If they care about long-term survival, cooperation becomes rational. The room grew quiet again. She continued, her voice steady. "But the riddle never states their core motivation clearly. That means we're meant to question it." A few guests looked uncomfortable. Felt less like entertainment now and more like a lesson. The billionaire crossed his own arms, mirroring her posture without realizing it. 10 minutes remained. Someone near the back shook their head. "This is too abstract. It has to be simpler." She turned slightly toward that voice. "Sometimes simple answers hide inside complicated stories." Then she looked back at the billionaire. "You designed this carefully," she said calmly. "Not to test math. Not even to test strategy. You designed it to test how people react under pressure." A murmur spread through the room. He didn't respond. He simply watched her. When you announced the prize, she continued, most people rushed. They looked for formulas. They searched online. They competed with each other instead of thinking quietly. She paused. But the first line of the riddle mentions trust. And tonight, no one trusted their own thinking. They rushed because of the money. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. 5 minutes remained. The billionaire finally spoke. Are you giving an answer? Not yet, she replied. The clock felt louder now, even though there was no visible timer. Everyone could feel it. She looked down at the final sentence again. Only when both keys turn without fear does the vault reveal its truth. Without fear. That phrase had been sitting there the whole time. She looked up slowly. The answer, she said carefully, is that the vault never needed 2 keys. A ripple of confusion spread instantly. She continued before anyone could interrupt. The partners believed they needed simultaneous action because they assumed distrust. But if they truly trusted each other, either key alone would have been enough. The requirement of 2 keys was a mental barrier, not a physical one. The room went silent. She took a breath. The riddle isn't about how to open the vault. It's about why they believed it was locked in the first place. The market crash didn't change the lock. It changed their fear. No one spoke. The billionaire's face was unreadable now. The playful confidence had faded into something more serious. She wasn't finished. You said the vault can only be opened if 2 keys are used at the exact same time. But that's based on the partner's agreement, not an independent fact. If one partner tested the door calmly, without fear, they would realize the mechanism never required both. A few people looked stunned. Others looked skeptical. An executive spoke up. But the riddle clearly states the rule. Yes, she replied gently. It states that the partners agreed to that rule. It never states that the vault itself enforces it. Silence. The billionaire's assistant shifted slightly, glancing at him. She met his eyes directly. You built the puzzle on a psychological trap, she said. You knew most people would treat the agreement as physical law. But it was just belief. The final minute stretched long. Someone whispered, "Is she right?" The billionaire did not move. His gaze remained fixed on her, studying every word. She kept her posture steady. No smile, no arrogance, just calm certainty. If the partners had trusted each other without fear, she finished softly, they would have discovered the vault was never locked by mechanics. It was locked by assumption. The room felt frozen. Outside the windows, the city lights flickered quietly, unaware of the tension inside. For the first time that night, the billionaire did not smirk. He simply stared at her, and the entire room waited for him to speak. No one moved. The silence after her answer felt heavier than all the noise earlier in the night. Even the soft music in the background had stopped at some point, though no one remembered when. She stood still, arms relaxed now at her sides. She had said what she needed to say. There was no dramatic tone in her voice, no attempt to impress, just quiet certainty. The billionaire looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You're saying," he began slowly, "that the lock was never physical." "I'm saying the story never proved that it was," she replied. A few guests exchanged glances. Some were confused. Others were starting to understand. He took a few steps toward the wide windows, then turned back to face her. The riddle clearly states that the vault can only be opened if 2 keys are turned at the exact same time. "Yes," she said calmly. "It states that the partners agreed to that condition. It never says the vault was tested independently. It never says the mechanism was verified." A finance executive shook his head. "But why would 3 intelligent partners create a rule that wasn't necessary?" She answered without hesitation. "Fear." The word landed softly but firmly. "When trust is strong, rules are simple," she continued. "When fear grows, people add layers of protection. Sometimes those layers become cages." No one interrupted her now. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, speaking not just to the billionaire but to everyone. The market crash in the riddle didn't break the vault. It broke their confidence in each other. So they tightened their agreement. They convinced themselves that both keys had to turn together. But they never questioned whether that belief was real. The billionaire crossed his arms again, but this time it looked thoughtful rather than playful. She went on, her tone steady. The final line says the vault reveals its truth only when both keys turn without fear. That line is not mechanical. It's emotional. It suggests the real barrier isn't metal. It's doubt. A soft murmur moved through the room. One of the guests, an older woman known for her sharp legal mind, stepped forward slightly. Are you suggesting the correct move was for one partner to try alone? Yes, she said. Not secretly, not to betray, but to test the assumption calmly. And if it didn't open? Someone asked. Then nothing would change, she replied. They would still need both keys. But the riddle never shows that test happening. It only shows fear driving behavior. The billionaire's assistant leaned closer to him and whispered something. He nodded slightly but kept his eyes on her. She could feel the weight of every stare in the room, but it didn't shake her. She had walked into rooms like this before, rooms filled with tension, rooms where decisions affected entire companies. She had learned that calm thinking often feels uncomfortable to people who prefer noise. The billionaire finally spoke again. Most people tonight tried to solve this as a coordination problem, a timing problem, a strategy problem. Yes, she said. And you believe it's a belief problem? She nodded. He walked toward a small table near the wall where an identical vault, small, decorative, likely symbolic, sat on display. It had 2 keyholes on the front. 2 polished keys lay beside it. Gasps moved through the crowd as he picked up one of the keys. You think it opens with one? He asked. I think the story never proves it doesn't, she replied. He looked at her for a long moment, then inserted 1 key into the vault. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. He turned it slowly. The faint click echoed, but the vault did not open. A few people let out quiet sighs of relief, as if they had been waiting for her to be wrong. He removed the key and picked up the second one. This time he placed both keys into the keyholes. Together? He asked. Without fear, she said softly. He turned both keys at the same time. There was another click. The vault door swung open. Inside was nothing but a folded piece of paper. The billionaire removed it and unfolded it carefully. He read it silently, then looked up at her again. You're partially correct, he said. A ripple of surprise moved across the room. The vault does require 2 keys, he continued, but not because of mechanics, because of agreement. He stepped closer, holding up the paper so others could see. On it were the words. The vault was always locked by trust, not steel. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply met his gaze. The physical lock exists, he said, but the deeper answer was about the assumption behind it. The room felt charged now, not with doubt but with realization. He walked slowly back toward the center. Most people tonight rushed to prove they were clever, he said, addressing the guests. They assumed complexity. They assumed competition. They assumed betrayal. He looked at her again. You assumed humanity. A quiet wave of understanding passed through the crowd. She spoke gently. Not humanity. Pattern. Explain, he said. In business, she replied. When partners stop trusting each other, they add safeguards. Extra approvals. Extra signatures. Extra meetings. Over time, those safeguards slow everything down. People start blaming the system, but the real issue is fear. Several guests shifted in place, recognizing the truth in her words. The riddle wasn't asking how to turn the keys, she continued. It was asking why they believed the keys had to turn that way. The billionaire studied her expression carefully, as if measuring more than just her answer. You didn't rush, he said, even when the money was announced. She gave a small shrug. Rushing makes people predictable. A faint smile returned to his face, but it was different now. Less smug, more respectful. And you think most of us were predictable tonight? I think you expected that, she said honestly. A few people laughed softly, but there was no mockery in it. He nodded slowly. I did. The tension that had filled the penthouse earlier began to dissolve. Conversations resumed quietly, but they were different now. Less competitive, more reflective. One guest approached her carefully. "How did you notice the assumption so quickly?" "I didn't," she admitted. "It took time. I just refused to treat every sentence as unquestionable truth." Another asked, "Were you certain?" "No," she said. "I was curious." The billionaire raised his hand slightly, drawing attention once more. "There's still one matter," he said. The room quieted again. "The prize." Eyes shifted between him and her. He stepped closer, his voice steady. "You identified the core of the riddle. You exposed the psychological trap. But the physical demonstration still required 2 keys. She nodded. "So tell me," he continued, "does that mean you solved it?" She held his gaze without hesitation. "It means the problem was never about the vault," she said. "It was about the thinking behind it." Another long pause filled the space. Then slowly he began to clap. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just steady, measured applause. After a second, others joined in. Not because they were told to, but because they understood what had just happened. The riddle had not only tested intelligence. It had revealed character. As the applause faded, the billionaire stepped forward once more. "You shifted the room," he said quietly. "That's harder than solving any puzzle." She remained calm. "I didn't shift it," she replied. "You did. I just answered." He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing something deeper than money. And for the first time that night, the smirk was completely gone. In its place was something far more interesting. Respect. The room had changed completely. The nervous energy that had filled the penthouse when the challenge began was gone. People no longer whispered or glanced at their phones. They simply watched her and the billionaire, curious about what would happen next. She stood near the center, arms relaxed, posture steady. She didn't move toward the vault or the money. She had no need to. The answer she had given and the calm way she had approached the problem had already shifted everyone's perception. The attention in the room was not about her anymore. It was about understanding the riddle, the psychology behind it, and, most importantly, what it said about thinking under pressure. The billionaire walked slowly toward her, holding a small tablet that displayed a confirmation screen. He glanced at it, then looked up at her. "Your answer was correct in essence," he said. His tone was calm, controlled. The vault itself could only open when both keys turned, yes. But as you pointed out, the real challenge wasn't about mechanics. It was about trust, perception, and fear. Most people overlooked that entirely. She nodded. Exactly. The keys were symbolic. The riddle wasn't asking about the vault. It was asking about the human mind, about assumptions, and how fear can control behavior without us even realizing it. He held the tablet in his hand and scrolled slightly. "You'll see in a moment," he said, "that the reward is real, not just symbolic." He turned the tablet so she could see. A confirmation number appeared. The funds had been wired. There was a soft murmur from the guests. Some looked impressed. Others tried to hide disbelief. A few shook their heads, unwilling to accept that a simple puzzle could involve such a large sum of money. But she didn't react. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. The amount wasn't important to her. What mattered was the proof that observation, patience, and careful thought mattered more than rushing, guessing, or showing off. The billionaire gestured toward the guests. "Observe this," he said. "Notice how fear and competition make people predictable. Notice how calm thinking can reveal patterns that others miss. That is the lesson tonight." She stayed quiet and let the moment speak for itself. Some guests scribbled notes in small pads. Others whispered quietly to each other. Everyone had learned something in a short period of time, whether they admitted it or not. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You didn't just solve a puzzle. You changed the room. That's harder than any riddle I've ever created." She met his gaze steadily. "I didn't change anything. I only paid attention." "That's the thing," he said. "Attention is rare. People always think they are observing, but most observed to react, not to understand. She nodded slightly. It's easier to act when you understand first. He looked around the room once more. Everyone else thought this was about competition, about proving themselves. They missed the meaning. You didn't. The guests continued to watch, uncertain whether to intervene or simply observe. There was a quiet respect in the air that hadn't been there earlier. Some of the people who had laughed at her questions now felt humbled. They had underestimated her not because she lacked ability, but because she had chosen calm over loudness. One of the younger investors stepped forward. "How did you see it so quickly?" he asked. "I spent almost the whole hour trying to apply formulas and theories." She smiled faintly, not arrogantly. "I didn't see it quickly. I took my time. I looked at the problem differently. I questioned the assumptions instead of rushing to answers." Another guest, older and more experienced, nodded slowly. "That's rare. Most of us never stop to question the rules we assume are true." She looked back at the billionaire, who now seemed to consider her in a way that was almost personal. "You designed the challenge to expose overconfidence," she said. "I didn't fall for it." He nodded. "I admit it. I expected someone to overthink it, to try to impress rather than understand. You didn't. You proved that humility and patience can reveal more than cleverness alone." The vault was still open on the table, the two keys resting neatly beside it. The guests glanced at it occasionally, but the focus had shifted. It was no longer about opening a locked object. It was about understanding the principle behind it, the lesson in perception, patience, and trust. She took a quiet breath and spoke again, more to herself than to anyone else. Most people focus on winning. They forget that the real test is understanding. A few of the guests whispered in agreement. Some shook their heads in silent acknowledgement. They had entered the room thinking they were there to compete. They now realized they had been tested in a completely different way. The billionaire cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back. "The funds have been transferred." The answer was correct. But more importantly, the approach was correct. Let this be a reminder that attention, patience, and understanding are more valuable than reaction and noise. He gestured at her again. Tonight, she showed what real insight looks like. She stayed composed. She didn't bow or acknowledge the applause. She didn't need validation. Her confidence didn't require recognition. She had demonstrated what she had come to prove, not just to him but to herself. Some of the guests tried to hide their embarrassment for underestimating her. Others smiled quietly, realizing that they had just witnessed something rare. The billionaire's challenge had been more than a riddle. It had been a mirror reflecting not just who could solve it, but who could see the world calmly and clearly under pressure. Minutes passed. The guests began to disperse, some congratulating her quietly. Some lingered, unsure whether they were impressed by her or by the lessons they had learned. The room had shifted from tension to quiet reflection. The billionaire approached her one final time. "Before anyone leaves, I want you to know something," he said. "The money isn't the point. It's a tool to see how people respond. And you responded exactly as you should." She nodded. "Then the test was complete." He smiled faintly. "Yes, and you passed." The night continued quietly after that. Guests continued small conversations, but they were different now. They were calmer, reflective, less competitive. They seemed to be thinking about what had just happened rather than planning their next move. She stepped away from the center and walked toward one of the large windows. The city stretched below, filled with lights and life. She looked down quietly, observing, thinking. She did not feel excitement over the money. She felt satisfaction in seeing clarity prevail. The billionaire watched her from across the room. He seemed to understand something about her that most people had missed. That she wasn't here to impress. That she didn't need validation. That her strength lay in calm observation, patience, and courage under pressure. For the rest of the evening, people came over to speak with her, ask questions, or simply observe. She answered them calmly, never boasting, never showing off. Each response reflected the same clarity she had demonstrated when solving the riddle. By the time the night ended, It was clear that the story of the puzzle, the vault, and the prize would be remembered long after the event. Not because of the money, but because of how it had revealed character, perception, and the quiet power of calm thought in a room full of noise and expectation. She left the penthouse quietly, without fanfare, carrying nothing but the lesson she had proven. That attention, patience, and understanding could solve problems that brute force or rushing never could. The billionaire watched her go, smiling faintly, already planning the next challenge, but knowing that tonight had shown something rare. A mind unshaken by spectacle, focused entirely on truth. The night ended quietly. The city lights outside the penthouse twinkled like a reflection of every small thought that had crossed her mind during the evening. She walked down the corridor, each step echoing softly against the polished floors. The crowd had dispersed, leaving only the memory of the challenge and the conversations it had inspired. People would remember it for weeks, months, maybe years, not for the riddle, not for the money, but for what it revealed about thinking under pressure. As she exited the building, the cool night air brushed against her face. It was refreshing, grounding, and a reminder that the world continued outside of grand challenges and wealth. She adjusted her coat slightly and began walking toward the quiet street. The money had already been transferred. The confirmation had flashed on the billionaire's tablet. It was real, tangible, but it didn't matter to her. She didn't need it to validate her worth or intelligence. She thought back to the moments in the penthouse, the laughter that had felt rehearsed, the whispers of doubt, the nervous energy of people trying to prove themselves. It was all predictable. She had seen it before in companies, in boardrooms, and in meetings where fear ruled decision-making. Most people never realized that fear shapes behavior as much as logic. It creates rules that are followed blindly, habits that are enforced without question, and assumptions that no one bothers to challenge. She remembered the billionaire's gaze during the challenge. His eyes had shifted from amusement to curiosity, from confidence to respect. He had created the riddle to expose overconfidence and predictability. And she had passed. Not by being clever, not by rushing, but by observing carefully, questioning assumptions, and staying calm. It was a simple lesson, but one that few truly grasp. A few blocks away, she stopped near a small park. The benches were empty, and the city felt quieter here. She sat down for a moment, letting the cool metal support her weight. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel a need to celebrate. Her mind replayed the evening, the steps she had taken, the choices she had made. She thought about the room full of people who had missed the deeper lesson. She thought about how quickly excitement, money, and competition can cloud judgment. And she thought about herself, how she had relied on observation and patience, not speed or showmanship. She pulled out her notebook from her bag. It was small, unassuming, and worn at the edges. She began jotting down thoughts, not the riddle itself, not the details of the vault, but the principles she had used. Calm observation, question assumptions, focus on the underlying problem, not the distractions around it. Understand the people involved, their fears, their motivations. Keep perspective and act only when clarity appears. These were lessons that applied far beyond one riddle or one night. They applied to life, to business, to human interaction. Passerby glanced at her notes, curious. She smiled faintly but didn't explain. Some things were not for others to understand immediately. Some things had to be absorbed quietly. She closed the notebook, stood, and continued walking. The city felt alive, but it felt manageable. She was aware of her surroundings, aware of herself, and aware that clarity often comes from quiet attention rather than frantic action. The next morning, the story of the challenge began to appear online. Headlines highlighted the $200 million prize, the billionaire's bold challenge, and the unexpected woman who solved it. Some articles focused on the spectacle. Others tried to analyze her methods. Many missed the real point entirely. Most readers were captivated by the money, the drama, the story of genius versus fortune. Very few paused to consider the lessons about fear, assumption, and calm observation. She read a few articles briefly and then closed her laptop. She didn't need validation from the world. She had proven to herself, and in the presence of the billionaire, that thinking clearly and acting thoughtfully mattered more than the applause of others. The real reward was understanding, the clarity that comes from seeing patterns that others miss, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you acted with integrity. Over the next few weeks, she returned to her regular life. Meetings with clients, business strategy sessions, and careful analysis of companies consumed her days. But everything felt subtly different. She noticed details she had overlooked before. She saw patterns in behavior, both in clients and competitors. She observed assumptions, unspoken fears, and hidden motivations. People who had seemed unpredictable before now made sense when she took the time to observe calmly. Her approach had always been thoughtful, but the challenge reinforced the power of patience and clarity. One day, she received a personal message from the billionaire. It was short and deliberate. "You understand more than most. Let's meet again soon." She smiled slightly, but she didn't rush to reply. Timing mattered. Observation mattered. She would respond when it was appropriate, not because of urgency or expectation. That was part of the lesson, too. She reflected on the event not as a test, but as a mirror. The riddle had shown more than the mechanics of a vault or the rules of a challenge. It had revealed human nature, the tendency to assume, to fear, to compete unnecessarily. And it had revealed what happens when someone refuses to play by those pressures. People follow patterns, often unconsciously. Fear limits creativity. Patience enables understanding. Calm attention can unlock insight that others miss. As the weeks turned into months, she noticed subtle changes around her. Colleagues began consulting her more deeply. They sought her input not because of authority or titles, but because of the way she saw patterns others missed. Clients started to value her advice more. She realized that what had happened that night in the penthouse was not just a puzzle solved. It was a demonstration of how quiet confidence and thoughtful observation can influence the world. She thought about the people in the room that night, the executives, the investors, the advisors, all who had initially rushed or tried to show off. She didn't feel pride over outperforming them. She felt empathy. She understood why they had acted as they did. She had been in similar situations before, and she knew how pressure and expectation can cloud judgment. What mattered was that she had acted differently. She had remained present, calm, and observant. Sometimes she returned mentally to that night, imagining the lights of the city below the penthouse, the tension in the room, the moment when the billionaire turned both keys in the vault. She imagined the looks on people's faces when they realized the deeper meaning of the challenge. And she appreciated that those lessons were not just for that evening. They were for life. Fear often disguises itself as rules. Competition often disguises itself as intelligence. And observation, patience, and clarity often go unnoticed until someone demonstrates them quietly, without drama, without need for applause. One evening, several months later, she walked past a busy street filled with people rushing home from work. She saw a man arguing loudly with a colleague, a group of students panicking over deadlines, and a family rushing through a store. She smiled faintly to herself. She saw patterns, fears, and assumptions all around her. And she understood that the lessons from the riddle and the vault were everywhere. Life itself was full of puzzles, hidden in plain sight, waiting for calm attention and thoughtful reflection. She didn't think of herself as special. She only knew that she had approached the challenge differently. That approach applied to everything: work, relationships, decisions, and even small daily choices. It wasn't about proving intelligence. It was about seeing clearly, acting wisely, and understanding the deeper structure of things. That was the real reward, the kind of reward that no amount of money could replace. And so, her life continued, quieter, more observant, more deliberate. She carried the lessons from the penthouse with her, not as a trophy, not as a story to tell, but as a framework for living. Attention over reaction, patience over haste, understanding over assumption. These were the tools she used every day. They were invisible to most, but they guided every choice she made, every decision she faced, and every person she interacted with. Occasionally, she thought of the billionaire. She thought of the way he watched the room, the way he smiled, the way he created challenges that revealed more about people than puzzles ever could. She respected him not because of wealth or power, but because of his understanding of human nature. He had created a situation that tested more than intellect. It tested observation, patience, and courage under pressure. And she had passed, quietly, deliberately, without drama, without need for recognition. She understood then that the greatest rewards in life were not always the ones announced loudly or displayed publicly. They were often hidden in the small, quiet choices, the decisions made calmly, without fear, and with attention to the reality of the situation. That understanding, that quiet clarity, was more valuable than any sum of money, any title, any applause. And as she continued walking through the city that night, the lights reflecting in her eyes, she knew that the real victory had always been hers. Not because she had won a challenge, but because she had learned to see clearly, to act thoughtfully, and to trust herself even when the world rushed around her.